Well, looks like I got a new microphone. Oh, and it's Halloween again. So what better way to celebrate this spooky time of year than to tell you all a scary story that I wrote. And it's about that one former Garfield writer, Kennywood. Never heard of it? Well, you're about to. Or you could just watch Kevin Pudger's video on it. It's good. I call this one Fright Nights at Garfield's Nightmare. Oh, and I guess I should put a trigger warning for all of these. Yeah, it's gonna be one of those stories. Here we go. I'm sure not a lot of you have ever been to or heard of Kennywood. It's a theme park located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania that started as a popular picnic location, but has since evolved to host popular rides such as Phantom's Revenge, Thunderbolt, The Exterminator, Jackrabbit, and the ride that has been with the park since its early days, the Old Mill. As its name implies, the Old Mill is a slow-moving boat ride that takes place in the dark, with some of them having scenes scattered throughout. They're commonly known as attractions where couples tend to do their private businesses, giving the ride type its nickname, the Tunnel of Love. Kennywood's Old Mill would undergo numerous themes and ride system changes over the years, including 1926 when the ride caught fire and was rebuilt from the ground up. In 2004, the ride received its most infamous overlay to date, Garfield's Nightmare, which was based on the popular comic strip character, well, Garfield. The attraction took guests through scenes that depicted the famous orange tabby fat cat experiencing a nightmare. Including being chased by an evil ice cream truck, eaten by a giant fish, coming face to face with a giant spider, and mice cooking cat stew. What made it stand out was the use of 3D. Many Garfield comic strips were reused, but painted in a specific color to where, when you put the 3D goggles on, it pops out at you. But it wasn't enough to distract from how the ride was pretty terrible. And funny enough, Kennywood themselves knew it, since they didn't want to make the ride too great or too scary considering Garfield is an IP associated with families. However, to the knowledge of nobody, that mindset would be thrown out entirely during the park's Phantom Fright Nights, which was for anyone above 13. As the ride was constructed on the concept of having it switch out during nights the event took place to make it much darker, grimmer, and scarier than what was presented to the public. I know this because I was one of the very few employees to witness it. I was an employee at Kennywood during the 2004 season, mainly operating Jackrabbit, and one of the perks was that I got to participate in an employee-only preview of that year's Phantom Fright Nights event. Included was what they dubbed an exclusive Fright Nights version of Garfield's Nightmare. I was confused when I saw it on the park map I was given for the event because Kennywood never publicly announced this in any way, but I guess they wanted to test it with employees to see how they respond before making it public. After going through the park's entrance tunnel, which was adorned with blinding red lights and masked characters with weapons, through the smoke, Garfield's Nightmare was the first thing I saw. With this exclusive version capturing my interest, I walked towards it and underneath the poorly lit marquee with Garfield, Odie, a spider, the mill, and text that read the ride's name popping out as 3D sculptures. The only difference I noticed in the queue was that the lighting was a shade of purple and green, obviously to resemble witch colors. But other than that, the worn-down Ryan house that served as a show building and a terrified Garfield looking through the window on top with its doors loudly opening and closing remained the same. I boarded my boat and put on my 3D glasses, and after passing through a small outdoor section that led to the inside, plus the visible window that showed the security office, I still don't know why they never bothered with it, I entered a long pitch-dark tunnel. The only sounds audible are a cold howling wind, the pitter-patter and splashing of the water moving the boat, and even the clanking of a very small lift hill. At the end of the tunnel, I could see a light. It was a TV that played an introductory animation featuring one of the mice characters from the strip. Usually the mouse, through some scary voice changer, welcomes guests to the ride, tells them how frightening it is, something about cheese, before turning to face the screen, telling guests in his normal voice to enjoy the ride, and the video resets. Or at least, that's how it regularly goes. Instead, as the boat began to move up the lift hill, the speakers blasted a loud, demonic, and distorted voice that spoke. I jumped. It immediately caught me off guard, but I quickly assumed that it was some sort of technical glitch. It wasn't until the mouse slowly turned to face the camera. He had some sort of grin on his face, and he whispered in an almost ghoulish manner.
Enjoy your ride.
His head slowly tilted to the side as if it was sliding off, his pupils growing to where his eyes have gone completely black, and his already wide smile grew wider and wider. My boat made a right turn, and it's when I heard a splattering thud. I immediately turned my back to see what was happening in the video, but it had already reset itself. I turned back around inside as I saw that the ride was dimly lit. I mean, it is a dark ride, but it was usually brighter than what I was seeing. Oh, that's right, I have my 3D glasses on. I take them off and... no, it's still very dark. Not a bright light in sight, plus the colors all just seemed pretty faded. I didn't like riding with the glasses anyway. Food products decorate the dark hallway, some of them having faces and 2 of them being shameless Pepsi product placement. And to my left was a comic strip about Garfield falling asleep after eating so much. However, not only was I barely able to make it out due to everything being so dark, but for some odd reason, all of the strips had Garfield's eyes completely blackened. Something that would apply to all of the strips, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Eerie sounds were playing and the music had gone absent, but there was still dialogue from Garfield. Over the speakers he could be heard saying,
"I have this strange feeling of indigestion."
The boat moved into the next showroom, and up until this point, I was thinking that maybe it was all just special effects and some extra stuff to make it look scarier, but other than that, the ride would be the exact same in terms of story. It ended up being the opposite. The next scene took place in John's living room, with Garfield sleeping on the floor in the middle of scattered food and pizza boxes. The yellow walls with small spiral patterns were now blank, dirty, and peeled. The furniture looked rotten and destroyed, and the cartoony evil eyes were gone. But instead, behind the moving door prop was a tall, shadowy figure with red pupils looking down at Garfield. This wasn't portrayed by a cardboard cutout like most of the characters are either. This was an actual 3-dimensional statue. It didn't even look human. I had so many questions on my mind that are too many to list, but I do remember one of them being... Is this some sort of elaborate joke? The boat made its way to the next tunnel. The cardboard pictures that depicted ice cream plastered throughout were gone, making it almost entirely pitch black until it got to a comic strip where Garfield was seemingly being chased by a dog, only for it to be revealed that they were both chasing an ice cream truck. You know, writing this made me realize Garfield comics are not that funny. Unrelated. Garfield's voice is heard again over the speakers.
"I never met an ice cream truck I didn't like, or lick."
The boat made another right turn, showing the moving 2D figure of a living ice cream truck with a scary face on its front with sentient ice cream driving it. Audible creaks as it swayed back and forth, but instead of it chasing Garfield, it was running him over. It was shown in a manner that didn't even look all squashed and stretchy, but instead looked genuinely painful, like an actual animal getting hit. A fudge popsicle looks down at Garfield, smiling, its face melting with its eyes popping out of its sockets.
"Mailman, the favorite snack of discerning people.
The next strip depicted Garfield scaring the mailman, and the following scene showed the mailman next to an animatronic dog barking, its jaw larger than its head and its teeth sharp as spikes. But this time the dog was shaking rapidly and something was dripping from its mouth. It was red water. I didn't believe it was blood, but when I got a whiff of a rather metallic scent, I could no longer tell whether or not it was real blood. It had to be some sort of effect, right? We had an employee blood donation a few months ago, but I doubt this was where our blood went, otherwise I'd be filing a lawsuit right now.
Who's scared of a teensy weensy spider?
The fourth strip showed Garfield batting off a small spider, and in the accompanying scene, the moving 2D cutout of a spider drawn in a cartoon style was replaced with a giant animatronic tarantula. Its fur all black, its eyes beaming red, and its mouth opening and closing as it stared down and roared at Garfield. The walls were covered with real-looking spiders too. Thankfully, the orange cat remained as a 2D cutout. As the boat moved to the next scene, Garfield was not heard over the speakers like he had been throughout the ride. It was the scene where Garfield, in the comic strip, eats a small fish alive before a new showroom showed him being eaten by a giant fish. This would be the only time in the ride Garfield was in animatronic form. Well, it only showed his legs, but I can't tell if this was intentional or if it just broke, but Garfield was not moving. Other than that, this was the only scene left unchanged and was the quietest part of the experience so far. I had a little time to breathe as I was trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. I didn't drink or smoke anything before I got here. I'm not about that life. And I know I'm certainly awake. Did they actually approve of this? I know this is supposed to be for a Halloween event aimed at mature guests, but this is Garfield we're talking about. Why would they be okay associating all of this with the IP's image? This thought circled my mind as the ride continued. The adjacent scene showed Garfield at the vet. Liz was pointing an injection needle at me with a very malicious look, but the hole that would be used to spray air at guests as an effect was patched with an actual giant needle that was dangerously sharp. The cutouts of Garfield and two dogs on both sides were replaced by a stretcher on Liz's left, which, strapped tightly to it, was an animatronic realistic looking yellow dog that seemed as if it had gone rabid, foaming out of the mouth, growling and howling, squirming and kicking, and its pupils looked dilated. Being that I loved dogs, I felt tears in my eyes. Before my boat left the showroom, the cutout Liz quickly moved towards me with the needle nearly a foot away from my face. My flight or fight kicked in if it hadn't already, but thankfully I wasn't stabbed, though I was certain they would get sued for that.
Why do I have this uneasy feeling that I pushed the pizza guy a little too far?
My boat moved to a scene when evil pizza guy uses a frightening animatronic pizza box with chomping sharp teeth, but the pizza inside was replaced with the moving human hands. Not an actual one, of course. The cutouts of alive pizza boxes and drinks were gone, and the background was completely black. There was audio coming from inside the box of a man screaming, but it was drowned out by audio of the pizza guy laughing maniacally.
I always say, one good pile of food deserves another.
It was now the kitchen scene, aka the largest showroom in the attraction. There was no comic strip scene at this time, so for a few seconds my boat flowed through complete darkness. But when I got to the room, like the previous one, it was almost entirely black. With the exception of a horrified-looking Garfield, a zombified Odie who looked to have cut his long tongue and wrapped it around his body, and what replaced John and a Frankenstein hot dog was a person attached to an electric chair, their face covered in a bag and shaking rapidly as loud buzzing noises are heard with the person audibly unable to breathe. Small flashes of light are seen. My right was completely dark, but I was able to see two small glowing red dots staring at me. Was that the figure from the first room? I assume so. Finally, the boat made its way into the last scene. Knowing it was the one where the mice in John's house were cooking cat stew, I was thinking it was gonna show Garfield being boiled alive with the skin melting or something. Every scene in this ride was just some messed up twisted variations of the original, and I was expecting the finale to be no different. I wish I was right. What I saw was much worse. The comic strip wasn't even the one where John scolds Garfield for not eating mice. This one was completely different. Instead of 3 panels separated from each other, it was 5 altogether. Panel number 1 showed Garfield sleeping in the pizza box surrounded by the mess, but he's squirming. It's implying we're seeing him have his nightmare from the outside. Panel number 2, John walks in and he's visibly upset. It almost looked like he had the face of someone who was just told their mother had passed away. He was in a tuxedo, his mouth was quivering, eyes bloodshot like he was crying the whole way back, and he was holding flowers, implying that he had another failed date with Liz. Panel number 3, he looked down at Garfield, who was still sleeping, and John's expression went blank. His eyes were still sore, but they widened as he stared down at his cat and the mess he made, sleeping in all of it. Panel number 4, John began to shake, his eyebrows furrowed, his teeth were gritted, and his fists were clenched. He looked furious. The final panel showed a close-up of John's angry eye in a drawing that resembled that one panel from the comic where Garfield is seemingly alone. He was clearly swaying and somehow his pupils went red. The red-eyed figure I already saw twice in the ride was John. A piece of dialogue was shown that was voiced over. John spoke in a trembling, sobbing manner.
Garfield, what have you done?
The strip ended there, but it wasn't long before John was heard over the speakers angrily yelling at the top of his lungs.
What have you done? What have you done?
I entered the final showroom, and it was John, in animatronic form, and with a sadistic look on his face, strangling Garfield by the neck and slamming his head onto the ground with audible thuds. The background audio was nothing but distorted sound effects as far as I can describe it. Garfield, who was also an animatronic but his face was not seen, could be heard screaming in agony as John choked him. Behind them both were large and very detailed eyes looking down at what was happening. My jaw dropped at the sight. I felt sick to my stomach and part of me just wanted to jump off this goddamn boat and get out, but I realized it was entering the final tunnel. Typically, the characters that tormented Garfield would be standing to my left as their normal, friendly selves portrayed by 2D figures and Garfield saying that the nightmare was over. But instead, the walls were stars. Fog was covering the water. The sad song I recognized from Here Comes Garfield played, marking the first time there was actual music in this godforsaken ride, and a soft angelic voice could be heard.
So long, old friend. Your nightmare's over now.
As the boat traveled through the tunnel, I was still in disbelief and in denial that what I just saw was even real. Questions were still running around in my mind. I was feeling lightheaded and it felt like I was about to throw up. I just sat back though, and let the boat finish its journey out of the show building and back to the loading station. However, there was one more thing waiting for me at the end of the tunnel. The extra room where the mouse from the opening video would take your picture was instead a garden. All the characters that appeared throughout the ride were 3D sculptures, and They were standing by and facing a tombstone that read, R.I.P. Garfield. The music stopped. No sounds beside the water. It was just silent. Suddenly, the boat came to a halt. It felt like I was stuck there for a minute straight. You gotta be kidding me, I mumbled under my breath. I then felt my cell phone drop out of my pocket, so I bent over to pick it up. I looked back over at the scene, and I froze. My eyes widened, and I could feel a shiver crawl up my spine with a sense of danger. The figures had turned their heads to stare directly at me. It wasn't the scariest part though. All of their faces were different. Some of them were blank, some of them had hollow holes as eyes and mouths, some of them had no mouth and only white pupilless eyes, and some of them were all contorted. The mouse was there as well, standing on top of Garfield's grave and his head missing, though I could tell he was looking at me too by the way his body moved. I wanted to get off, but before I could do anything, I saw a very bright flash, and just like that, the boat was moving again and had finally gotten out of the building. After passing by a mini waterfall, I was back at the loading station, and above me, the comic created exclusively for the ride where Garfield exits with all of his nightmares following him was replaced with text. It was a quote from Jim Davis, Garfield's creator. Quote, "An imagination is a powerful tool. It can tint memories of the past, shade perceptions of the present, or paint a future so vivid that it can entice or terrify, all depending upon how we conduct ourselves today." End quote. The nightmare was over. I immediately leapt out of the boat and went to the nearest trash can to vomit. One of the employees walked towards me and asked if I was okay, and I yelled back, still breathing heavily and shaking, "Are you guys high? What the hell was that?" I immediately apologized, assuring the employee it wasn't their fault and that I just had a bad experience in there. They told me that I wasn't the only one who complained and that many employees were distraught and felt ill after riding whatever version of the ride this was. By sheer coincidence, a boat pulled up to the station with an employee in it, and he was lying unconscious. Paramedics were called and the ride was shut down for a night. I later learned that the man suffered a heart attack due to the intensity of the experience, so it was one incentive out of 100 others for Kennywood to not move forward with the Phantom Fright Nights edition of Garfield's Nightmare. Before I left the area that night, I was able to see that my ride picture was snapped. It was pretty embarrassing, so I hope nobody else saw it. I quit my job after the season ended, but I still visited the park from time to time because I still like going there. I've given Garfield's Nightmare the occasional ride from my visits over the years, watching it slowly break and age until it finally closed at the end of 2019 to be reverted back to the old mill. Every single prop was destroyed because Viacom, Garfield's owner, didn't want him to end up on the black market, so aside from some references in the new ride, Garfield just no longer exists in Kennywood. Can't say it wasn't for the better, though hearing every remnant was destroyed makes me sad. Maybe the IP could come back to the park without some nightmarish horror attraction someday. And I can only hope there's lasagna. I'm such a genius writer, aren't I?
Can you believe Pete trying to scare us like that?
I don't know. I'm kind of scared.